Beneath Borneo by Stygian Sagas. Indonesia might have seized its independence from its Dutch colonizers in 1949, but that didn't put an end to the external involvement on the islands. The West proved a less menacing ally than Mao's China in those early days, so President Sukarno was willing to turn a blind eye now and then when a European or American firm wished to develop a mining or timber operation on its islands. As long as a native, or Havanese more like, seemed to be running things, the fiercely protectionist economic policy of the new government would seem totally intact. I came to the island of Borneo in late January 1967, alongside a group of 4 prospective silver miners from Nevada, who wished to expand upon the rudimentary operations of the locals. We were kept hushed up about our purpose on the island, and it was an added selling point for our new employers that not one of us spoke Indonesian, or any of the myriad of local languages for that matter. Our overseer, a sturdy Jakartan man with the air of governmental importance, didn't even give us his name. As I understand it, he introduced the handful of us to the locals as advisors, and ensured the few villagers we passed while boating in the interior didn't get a chance to mingle with us. The ride inland was defined by buzzing, gnawing insects, and the heat so dense with moisture it catch you in your throat like snot. It was a heat that somehow made the arid scorch of the Nevada deserts back home seem tame, and left me feeling nauseous for at least the first few days of the expedition. The murky swamps along the coast gave way to rough water as we followed the river into the mountains. We seemed to spend as much time portaging the boats around the rapids as we did steadily motoring upstream. The muddy banks were uncomfortably thin, close to both the tepid brown water and the impenetrably thick mire of leaves, vines, and gnarled roots that carpeted the jungle. The others didn't seem to be as worried as I was. I couldn't help but notice the Havanese porters among us hurried us on whenever we carried the boats along the shore, always conscious of the time spent mired in the muck and trapped in the open. The miners chatted about the job ahead to distract from the monotony of the sweat-stained trip into the jungle, but I wasn't here for the silver, and their talk of drills and transports was a foreign language to me. I'd been hired as an insurance against the tigers which roamed the island, and I kept my rifle close at hand throughout the trip, leaving it cradled beneath my arm whenever we moored in the shallow riverside pools to sleep in the boats at night. No crocodiles troubled us in the lower swamps, but they tended to steer clear of the motorboats, and the higher stretches of river were guarded by rapids that kept them out. It was the cats in the trees that concerned me. Each flash of a flowered plant or a tropical bird in the foliage had me gripping my gun until my eyes could process what had broken the tangle of tenebrous greens that pressed greedily in all around us. These bursts of color never spat forth a tiger, but, if anything, the lack of focus for my nerves only heightened them. The crocodiles, at least, had sunned on the banks or lazily watched from the shallows, their glinting eyes belaying a hunger they weren't bold enough to fulfill. If there were similar glinting eyes on the landward side, slinking through the trees, not one of them spotted us. Their lurking owners might just not have been there. The Borneo tigers were a dwindling breed even back then. But with each drowning mile down the lonely, mosquito-haunted river, my own imagination left me certain there was more than jabbering monkeys behind the green shroud throttling the banks. Our isolation didn't help, for the bustling stilt villages that had lined the shore close to sea had all but disappeared. And our Havanese overseer knew little about the region which we traveled through, save its name. Indeed, he and his fellows from Indonesia's most vital island seemed almost disgusted by the locals, fretting about thieves and savages and brigands in the slums which we occasionally docked for food. Still, for all their worry, I slept easier with an earshot of the indecipherable Bornean villagers chatting and gambling their nights away than I ever slept bobbing on the riverside, scanning the jungle for massive slitted pupils. A week brought us at least to the beginning of the river, where many tiny mountain streams pooled to feed the long descent to the Java Sea. We continued on foot, tracing meandering paths uphill through the mountains. If I'd thought the press of the jungle on the riverbank was suffocating, the little pathway through its bowels was another thing altogether, leaving us to put single file, with me at the rear, my eyes scanning the trail behind me as often as the mountain climbs in front. Once again, my paranoia proved vain. We reached the mouth of the silver mine just before dusk, my heart leaping at the prospect of sleeping with the sturdy little cabins the locals had cobbled together for us. The crag in the jungle-choked mountains was small, and my companions immediately set about making plans on just how they'd get components for large-scale machinery upriver for assembly near the rudimentary little silver mine. Now that they had their eyes on the place, the Havanese workermen showed them around at the behest of our overseer, leaving me to settle in and enjoy a modest meal of rice and smoked fish. The evening played out well, and after a few hours swapping stories over a low fire between the cabins, I enjoyed the first real sleep I'd had in days. The rigid wood floor beneath me did nothing to dull how rejuvenated I felt by the time the sun rose and the camp began to bustle. When the overseer dispatched a couple of the Havanese men back to the river to fetch what was needed for the mining equipment from the towns downstream, I went along with them to the boats, rifle in hand, ensuring no tigers slunk out from the trees. My lonely walk back was tense, but I was beginning to feel at ease in the den of the jungle, and the proximity of the trees weighed less on me. At home in Borneo forests or New World deserts, I had initially been drowned in the sensations of the raucous forest, but now I began to find methods in their madness. The birds, the cackling apes, had rhythms to their schedules and calls. The buzz of insects faded to white noise once you got used to their constant drone. The jostling branches by small animals in the underbrush ceased to make me jump, and the call of strange frogs and crickets ceased to be strange. By the time dusk came on our second day at the mining camp, I begun to actually enjoy the claustrophobic beauty of the drooping leaves and interwoven vines. And I drifted off, satisfied that the months ahead wouldn't be as agonizing for me after all. This isn't to say I let my guard down. I kept an ear out for the lulls in the clamor of the forest, and I kept my eyes trained on breaks in the leaves where a threat might dwell. During the second week, as more parts were brought upriver for expanding the mine, I picked out a yellow viper half-mast among the tree limbs, hanging over the path toward camp. The path to the riverbank became second nature to me, as did the perimeter of the clearing on the mountainside where the mine broke the moss-eaten stone. When the first month came to a close, and my companions had gotten a sizable drilling machine built to carve their way deeper into the hills, I was feeling right at home. That comfortable security was not to last. We enjoyed a comfortable relationship thus far with the small village to the west of our encampment. They'd send a few armed porters every week to deliver fruit, bushmeat, and eggs. They were generally in and out, very business-oriented, but always punctual. So when they missed their delivery at the beginning of the fifth week, we assumed they'd been held up by the storm that had shaken the jungle the night prior. We waited, but 2 more days passed without word from the village, and our sparse reserves of meat was beginning to dry out. It was only when a group returned from fetching gasoline and rice downriver that we learned the village had radioed local forestry personnel to complain of several missing residents who were walking the path toward our camp. Presumably, their distress call speculated they were victims of a tiger attack. We mulled it over, and finally our overseer let us send a message back downriver to transmit to the village. I asked for more information, and upon the boat's return, he told me the villagers had possessed only 2 serviceable rifles. Both had been lost with the missing trio of porters. The villagers had probed the trail with bows and spears, but found that the mudslide had shorn away the precarious mountainside trail during the almost omnipresent seasonal rains, forcing whomever wished to walk the route between our encampment and the village to do so in the green tangle of the valley floor below. Any area of Borneo that was not a sheer rock face or a pre-cleared pathway seemed to be an emerald prison of constricting growth. It was no wonder a search party with bows had turned back rather than risk encountering a dangerous animal in the woods. Whether it's a python or a big cat, the prospect of suddenly coming face to face with a predator in the leafy prison all around us was no small thing. It made my stomach lurch to hear they requested we walk up the trail to meet them and help them in the search for the men. I could hardly decline, however. The forestry service in Borneo might as well have been a cartel in those days, and it wasn't likely aid would come from anywhere else for a long time. 4 days after our missing shipment, I set out up the winding trail along the mountainside that snaked away from our camp. With me came 2 Havanese men armed with their own old rifles, holdovers from the revolution, they eagerly told me. While they weren't locals, they were better acclimated to the jungle than I, and knowing they put their weapons to good use before put me at ease. We could communicate very little, for my own handful of Indonesian words was matched equally by their sparse English vocabulary. Still, we could read expressions, and the first few hours on the steep pathway around the mountain was spent drinking in the scenery. The landscape was beautiful from the heights, for there were stretches of the switchback trail that climbed along the stony slope separated from the trees below, allowing me to look out across the waves of rolling green-girdled hills and valleys. Save for the occasional outcrops of sturdy ferns and woven scrubs on the mountainside, there was very sparse cover for the imagination to project lurking predators into, leaving our eyes free to wander. The humidity lessened out there in the open, and the sky was clear. The ascent seemed to have left the gnawing insects behind, and for the first time, I could actually enjoy Borneo. It was a wild afternoon when we came across the massive mudslide, barring our path and dispelling the joyous freedoms we felt traipsing the cliff face above the tree line. The wooded heights of the mountain above us had been swept down the slopes in the storm, and a half-dry morass of muck, pincushioned with dead trees and jagged rocks, ran the full 200 or 300 yards down the hill to the awaiting canopy in the valley beneath us. It was as if the mud had laid siege to the stony cliff face, only to be devoured by the waiting jungle, which lay calm and placid below, its bustle of sounds lost on us from where we stood above the canopy. We resolved to wait a while to see if the group from the village which aimed to meet us here would soon show up. They had a shorter hike out, but we reasoned they might have been distracted or delayed and were unable to give us a warning, given how disconnected our camps were. The leavings of the mudslide were perhaps 200 feet across. While it seemed it would be dangerous to attempt to scale across it without sliding down into the jungle below through the jagged graveyard of roots and upturned trunks, we could see where the path continued beyond the sprawl. We kept watch for them, but as the afternoon slipped onward into the evening, the 3 of us grew more and more certain something was wrong. My 2 companions talked amongst themselves, most of their words lost on me through the language barrier. They seemed agitated, arguing over something, frequently pointing across the treacherous mudbank to the further pathway and gesturing down into the jungle below. Then one prompted me to weigh in, with broken English asking whether I thought the villagers had already descended the mudbank to try and find a way across and up the other side. I found it hard to believe a group of searchers so wary of predator-prone trees in the valley would risk the slippery mire of refuse without having seen us. After all, the whole point of us meeting them here was to hearten them for the search. It was only when we sat exhausted an hour and a half before sunset, still at a loss for explanation and debating the best course of action, that an action was decided upon for us. Up from the jungle, muffled behind the intervening carpet of greenery, a long, low wailing sounded, holding the hopelessness of a cry of a hurt child, run through with gasps and stutters as if the screams were sobbing. 3 of us were at once keyed into the forest at the foot of the mudbank, its verdant shadows already lengthening in the evening's dying light. I had almost asked a question about descending the slope aloud when slurred words rang out, punctuating the ending of the wail, broken by some desperate gasping that scored the awful scream. The 2 Havanese men spoke little of the myriad of local languages of Borneo, but they recognized enough to tell me The garbled words had been a plea for help. Hope from God, as they heard it. At once we were clambering down the treacherous mud bank, half sliding, half crawling, catching gnarled roots and torn sticks as handbrakes. We had little idea of how we might escape the valley, for the muddy slope was so steep and so slick that climbing back up it seemed impossible. But the horrible agony and the cry swept away any thoughts of hesitation we might have held. By the time we tumbled past the canopy into the depths of the forest with rifles held at the ready, the trees had fallen silent again. Indeed, the area we entered was remarkably quiet, a hush that went far deeper than the end of the pained screams which had drawn us down from the mountain's path. The birds seemed gone from this part of the jungle, and the clatter of monkeys or snakes in the trees had fallen away. The only remnant of the familiar jungle panoply which had served as a backdrop to our camp was the not-so-fond buzzing of mosquitoes and flies, more resonant now than ever. It took us some time to realize this, for the canopy made the noise of our clumsy descent into the valley into a cacophony. Once one of my companions mentioned it, though, none of us could shake how strange this place felt. The jungle around us was more swamp than solid ground. The trees here were broad but relatively sparse, and their trunks were surrounded by a murky soup of tepid water, only occasionally broken by muddy islands and twisted root pathways between the bloated trunks. This part of the valley seemed like some sort of drainage dump for the surrounding mountains. It carried the sickly, paradoxically sugary scent of rotten plant matter and fungal growth. My fear of tigers fast abated, for they wouldn't thrive in a place like this. Still, the repulsiveness of our new surroundings seemed to wash away my memory of those awful screams. The place made me wish I'd stayed up on the mountain. It took the group of us a moment to begin picking our way through the gloom. Partly this was due to our repulsion, but even once we'd gotten underway, the Stygian mire made progress slow. My companions called out in Indonesian, their words echoing out over the swamp as we skirted along stagnant pools and tested caked mud with fallen limbs to ensure it was safe to tread on. We kept an eye out for snakes, though the roots and mud in the shadowy water made certainty difficult. We were far more worried about poisonous vipers than pythons we knew that may lurk in the depths. The latter could be hacked to pieces with machetes before its work was done, whereas a single bite from the former could spell death for any one of us. The water seemed as vacant as the land, and as the minutes ticked by, our apprehension grew, with each failed call into the bent and mangled trees still going unanswered. It took nearly 10 minutes for that dreaded call to come again. The scream rang out just as we began to consider retreat, reverberating over the water from deep in the swamp. It was deafening, amplified by the leafy roof above, and from here it sounded more ragged. It was punctuated by those same halting, juddering rasps which we had thought were sobs before. From the ground, I wasn't so sure. They sounded more like air escaping a burst tire rather than shuddering breaths. The vocalization accumulated in another call for help, and it struck me. The words sounded strange. Their droning candescence seemed almost mechanical, void of the moisture of a living lung. We stayed frozen in place until they'd ceased, their last echoes playing out in the distance through the trees, sending a distant cloud of bats skyward through the leaves. They were hard sounds to listen to, made all more awful by the growing shadows all around us, deepened by the coming of dusk. It was easy to dream up all manner of things which could slink and sneak through these shadows as we summoned up the courage to advance and call out for the injured screamer. But we didn't have to imagine for long. Scaling a steep mud bank, we came through a hedge of thickly woven vines to see yet another stagnant pool. This one far deeper and wider than most of the others in the swamp. Its surface was split here and there with long, spindly things. We saw dead trees or roots plunged up from the muck to tower up 10, 12 feet over our heads. One of my companions called out once more, and his words seemed to stir up movement near the center of the pool. Ripples slunk their way across the brown liquid from the base of the spiny plants nearest the center, drawing our eyes to them. and the things which hung atop them. It took us only a moment to pick out the corpses through the gloom. The swarming flies and heightened stink help us determine what it was that we saw. But they were mangled beyond belief. The 3 men had been run through on the spindly trees, the spiny tips protruding through their mouths, impaled like the Turks during their marches in Wallachia. Their bodies were bloated, their flesh sloughed off like hot wax. Their sodden limbs hung loose at their sides. They shuddered again, but we saw it was not the corpses themselves that moved. Rather, it was 3 tree-like spines which they had been skewered on. The botanical-looking forest of branches all retracted at once, back down towards the water, sinking a few feet into the murk. When they did so, the screaming began again, washing over us with renewed vigor, its volume so intense, it set my head throbbing as if I'd been physically stricken. I've had far too many years to ruminate on what was happening. Those protrusions from the mud raked the interior of each corpse's throat as they withdrew, I think. Though I can't be certain, I imagine their rough surfaces displaced air and lacerated long-dead vocal cords in such a way that the dead were played like string instruments. They sounded a long, dismal note before surging back up to their full height once more. Not one of us could deny that we'd seen them all move, whether they bore one of the corpses or not. The whole forest of them shivered and twitched, writhed in the air with movements so slight they might have jostled branches, like the hairy, many-jointed legs of an insect. Though it took our minds several moments to process what we'd seen, we scattered when one of the stiff limbs nearest the shore lazily bent towards us. We scrambled back to the lip of the slope where we came, and I swear to this day, I saw a great shape stir beneath the water as we went, darkening the opaque stew in which it brooded beneath its prey. Reaching the camp by following the base of the mountains was reasonably easy, even in the dark. It was made all the easier by the fact that tigers and snakes seemed a trifling worry to the 3 of us from what we'd seen in the swamp. What followed our return was confusing, to say the least. For us foreigners were let in on little of what was said. The village was radioed after a hasty trip downriver, and it was agreed that the mountain pathway would be cleared and no more searches would be sent down into the swamp after their missing clansmen. I talked little with the men who shared their experience with me. They abandoned the expedition the following week, and I was too shaken to think to consult them after they'd gone. I didn't last another month, for the overseer seemed to have grown wary of me, perhaps doubting my mind was holding up under the strain of the environment, or perhaps wanting to keep me from talking about what I'd seen in the swamp. A new hired gun was brought up from southern Borneo, and I was dispatched downriver to return home. I didn't exactly mind. The further I was from that jungle, the better. The discharge, however, doomed me to wonder, to replay in my mind, again and again, the events of that balmy evening in Borneo, without a way to ask locals what light they might shed on the subject. I've never been able to dig up anything similar to what we saw in the anthropological records, or folklore, or even the local legendary, despite my snooping around. I reasoned it couldn't have been something the Bornean people knew about. They wouldn't have assumed a tiger was responsible if such travesties that we saw regularly dwelt in the lowland swamp. This leaves me to think it was a massive sort of crustacean or an insect from beneath the soil, something dredged up by the mountain's innards during the mudslide that just happened to rest in the swamp, where we had the misfortune of seeing it. So, was it knowingly baiting us in? If so, why did it seem so languid and slow? I mean, if it was full or simply uninterested in taking us, why make the screams at all? I mean, what was it? I'm caught between desiring answers and wishing I could forget the questions entirely. Whatever it was, I only hope its new home proved inhospitable to it. I pray it withered and died outside of the earth from where it brooded. Now in this swamp, a horrible fish removed from the water in which it was evolved. That does little to calm my nerves about what may yet lurk beneath the mountains of Borneo. I'm old enough now that I don't have long left to wonder, which is a small mercy. If fate is kind, I will never know if there's more of them.